Leo Maxwell thought he had only inherited a graveyard of rusted steel, but his German shepherd, Kaiser, knew there was something more. The dog ignored the giant cranes and decaying warehouses. Instead, an invisible force pulled him to a secluded strip of sand, a place seemingly forgotten by time. Ignoring Leo's calls, Kaiser began to dig with a desperate urgency, as if trying to excavate a memory. And then, from the cold, damp sand, he pulled out something that didn't belong there, a small, faded child's backpack. But it was the item preserved inside that made Leo's heart stop. A luggage tag wrapped in plastic, bearing a little girl's name and a one-way destination: Canada. In a town being consumed by a silent sickness, Leo realized he hadn't inherited a property. He had inherited a dark secret, and the first clue had just been delivered by his loyal dog. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The old Ford pickup truck groaned as it crested the final hill, the engine complaining after the long journey north. Below them, nestled in a gray curve of the Maine coastline, lay the town of Port Blossom. It was a place that seemed to be actively surrendering to the sea and the sky, its colors muted as if an artist had washed over the entire landscape with a dirty brush. Rust bled from the edges of the welcome sign, the painted flowers of its name having long since peeled away. Behind the wheel, Leo Maxwell kept his hands steady at 10 and 2, a habit from a life that demanded control in moments of chaos. He was a man in his late 30s, though the miles etched around his eyes suggested more. His build was lean and practical, the kind shaped by necessity rather than vanity. His short brown hair was beginning to show threads of silver at the temples, and a faint pale scar cut a line through his left eyebrow, a permanent reminder of a day he tried hard to forget. His face, often set in a quiet, observant mask, was softened only by the deep kindness in his hazel eyes, a kindness that had seen too much. He had left the army 5 years ago, but the quiet vigilance of a combat medic had never truly left him. A heavy head settled on his right shoulder, followed by a soft, warm puff of air against his neck. Leo glanced over, a faint smile touching his lips for the first time that day. Kaiser. The German shepherd was 6 years old, a magnificent animal in his prime. His coat was a thick, beautiful blend of silver gray and white, a stark contrast to the typical black and tan of his breed. His ears were perpetually alert, his dark, intelligent eyes missing nothing. To strangers, his size and watchful stillness could be imposing, but to Leo, he was a steady anchor in a world that often felt adrift. The dog had been a gift from his unit, a furry, clumsy puppy that had grown into the most loyal partner a man could ask for. Now, sensing the tension in his human, Kaiser whined softly, a low rumble of concern in his chest. "Almost there, buddy," Leo murmured, reaching over to scratch behind the dog's ear. Just a little farther. As they descended into Port Blossom, the oppressive atmosphere of the town settled over them like a damp shroud. It wasn't just quiet. It was unnervingly still. Houses that should have been charming seaside cottages were instead studies in neglect, their paint peeling in long strips, their porches sagging like tired shoulders. Leo saw faces in the windows, pale and drawn, their eyes following the truck's slow progress with a mixture of suspicion and profound weariness. A few people sat on their front steps, staring into the middle distance, their bodies slumped in postures of defeat. What struck Leo most, what his medic's eye couldn't unsee, was the sickness. It was in the sallow color of their skin, in the gaunt set of their cheekbones, in the way a woman coughed a deep, rattling cough into her fist as she hurried inside, pulling a thin sweater tighter around her frail frame. It was a town steeped in a quiet, chronic misery. He pulled up in front of a small, unassuming building with a faded sign that read, Abernathy Law. As he cut the engine, the sudden silence felt heavy, broken only by the distant cry of a gull. "Stay here," Leo said to Kaiser, giving him a final pat. The dog watched him with an unwavering gaze as he stepped out of the truck, the salty, damp air carrying a faint, unpleasant undertone, something vaguely chemical. The office was dim and smelled of old paper and dust. A stooped, elderly man with a fringe of white hair and thick glasses looked up from a large wooden desk. This was Mr. Abernathy, the lawyer who had called him a week ago with the bewildering news. "Mr. Maxwell," the lawyer said, his voice dry as rustling leaves. He gestured to a worn leather chair. "Thank you for coming. I was Colonel Donovan's attorney for many years." Leo sat, his posture straight, his hands resting on his knees. He had not seen the colonel in almost a decade, not since the funeral for Donovan's wife. James Donovan had been more than a commanding officer. He had been a mentor, a father figure who had seen potential in a lost young man and guided him with a firm but fair hand. The news of his passing from a sudden heart attack had felt like a distant, delayed shockwave from an old explosion. "I've prepared all the necessary documents for the transfer of property," Mr. Abernathy continued, sliding a thick folder across the desk. "As stipulated in his final will and testament, the entirety of the Donovan family estate, which consists of the Port Blossom shipyard and its surrounding land, is now legally yours." Leo stared at the folder, the words barely registering. A shipyard. It made no sense. "Sir, I don't understand. The colonel—" We hadn't spoken in years. "He had no other family?" Mr. Abernathy shook his head slowly. "None left, and he was very specific in his instructions. He also left this for you, to be given to you in person." The lawyer handed him a simple, sealed envelope. Leo's name was written on the front in the colonel's sharp, familiar handwriting. He felt a lump form in his throat as he carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the lines of ink. "Leo, if you are reading this, then I am gone. I apologize for the abruptness of this inheritance, but I have run out of time, and there is no one else I can trust. The shipyard has been in my family for generations, a legacy of building things that sail on the sea. In my lifetime, however, it became something else, a legacy of a different kind. I am leaving it to you, son, not just because of the respect and affection I hold for you, but because of who you are. I have never met a finer combat medic. Your purpose has always been to save lives, to run toward the suffering when others run away. That skill, that instinct, is needed here more than ever. Consider this my final order. There is a mission to finish, a promise I made that I could not keep in life. The shipyard holds the key. Look closely. The people of this town deserve a fighting chance. Don't let them be forgotten." Yours, Colonel James Donovan Leo, read the letter twice, a cold weight settling in his stomach. A mission, a promise. He looked up from the page, his mind racing, the image of the sick, weary faces he had just seen flashing in his mind. The hostility he had felt from their stares suddenly felt less like malice and more like something else. Despair. He folded the letter and placed it carefully in his jacket pocket. After signing the documents in a daze, he shook Mr. Abernathy's hand and walked back out into the gray afternoon. The drive to the shipyard took only a few minutes. It was located at the far end of the cove, a sprawling, skeletal giant against the horizon. A high, chain-link fence, topped with rusted barbed wire, surrounded the property. Leo used the key from the lawyer to unlock the heavy gate, which shrieked in protest as he pushed it open. He drove the truck through and parked near a large, derelict warehouse. He got out, and Kaiser immediately hopped down beside him, his nose twitching as he took in the new smells of cold iron, old oil, and briny decay. Before them lay a scene of industrial death. Huge, rusted skeletons of cranes clawed at the sky. Weeds grew thick and tenacious through cracks in the concrete. The wind whistled through the empty shells of buildings, creating a low, mournful sound. It was a graveyard of ambition, a place where purpose had long since rusted away. Yet, as Leo stood there, the colonel's letter felt like a heavy stone in his pocket. He looked at the vast, silent legacy before him, then down at Kaiser, who stood pressed against his leg, a warm, living presence in the midst of all the decay. A mission to finish. Leo took a deep breath, the cold Maine air filling his lungs. He had come to Port Blossom seeking peace, a quiet place to outrun his ghosts. He now understood that he had been brought here for a different reason entirely. He had been brought here for a war. The first morning in Port Blossom broke without a sunrise, the sky simply fading from charcoal to a flat, bruised gray. Leo had spent a restless night in the truck, the words from the colonel's letter replaying in his mind like a persistent echo. He woke to the feeling of Kaiser's cold nose nudging his hand, the dog's soft whine a gentle summons to the day. After a meager breakfast of protein bars and bottled water, they began to explore. Leo moved with a quiet, methodical purpose, his steps sure-footed as he navigated the treacherous landscape of rust and ruin. He started with the main warehouses, their cavernous interiors dark and silent, smelling of damp concrete and ghosts. Sunlight struggled through grime-caked windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air. Everything of value had been stripped long ago, leaving only heavy, immovable machinery bolted to the floors like ancient idols in a forgotten temple. Kaiser stayed close to his side, but an unusual restlessness had taken hold of him. His ears twiveted constantly, and his nose was perpetually in the air, testing scents that Leo couldn't begin to decipher. While Leo was focused on the obvious structures, Kaiser seemed drawn to the periphery, his gaze often fixed on a dense, overgrown section of the property that bordered the cove. By midday, Leo had worked his way to the massive skeletal structures of the dry docks, where ships were once built and repaired. Here, the sense of decay was most profound. Steel beams thick as a man's chest were flaking away in orange sheets. It was a place of immense power, now rendered completely inert by time and neglect. As Leo examined the corroded winch of a giant crane, he felt a determined tug on the worn leather leash in his hand. He looked down. Kaiser was staring at him, his body tense, his gaze directed firmly toward the tangled wall of wild roses and overgrown seagrass to their left. The dog let out a low, insistent whine. "What is it, boy?" Leo asked, his voice soft. Kaiser tugged again, harder this time, pulling him away from the main path. He was insistent, his purpose clear. Leo hesitated for a moment, then sighed. He had learned long ago to trust the dog's instincts. Kaiser had an uncanny ability to sense things that were out of place, a skill that had alerted Leo to hidden dangers more than once in the quiet mountains where they had tried to find peace. All right, Leo relented. "Lead the way." The dog's tail gave a single, satisfied thump against Leo's leg before he plunged into the undergrowth. The path was barely there, a faint trail that had been reclaimed by nature. Thorny branches snagged at Leo's jacket, and his boots sank into the soft, damp earth. It was clear that no one had come this way in a very long time. After about 50 yards of pushing through the dense foliage, the thicket suddenly opened up. They stood before a long, low structure, its corrugated metal roof almost completely obscured by a thick carpet of moss and creeping vines. An old, faded canvas tarp had been stretched across its wide entrance, held down by heavy chains and rusted anchors. It was perfectly camouflaged, designed not to be found. It was a secondary boat slip, completely hidden from the main shipyard and the town. Kaiser padded forward and nudged the heavy tarp with his nose, looking back at Leo expectantly. A cold knot of intrigue tightened in Leo's stomach. This was something different. This was a place of secrets. But before Leo could investigate the slip, Kaiser's attention shifted. He trotted past the hidden entrance toward a small, secluded crescent of sand and pebbles that lay just beyond it, a private beach sheltered from the rest of the cove. The dog's demeanor changed from insistent to urgent. He lowered his head, his nose skimming the surface of the damp sand, sniffing in frantic, audible bursts. He paced a small area near the high tide line, a line of kelp and driftwood marking the water's last reach. Then he stopped. He looked back at Leo, his dark eyes wide, and let out a single, sharp bark. Without waiting for a command, he began to dig, his powerful front paws sending sprays of wet sand flying behind him. He dug with a frantic energy that Leo had never seen before, a desperate need to unearth whatever lay beneath. Leo walked over, his boots crunching on the shells. "Easy, boy. What did you find?" Kaiser ignored him, his focus absolute. A moment later, his claws hit something soft. He pulled back, whining and nudging at the object with his snout. Leo knelt beside his dog, the knees of his jeans sinking into the cold, wet sand. He reached into the shallow hole, and his fingers brushed against waterlogged fabric. Carefully, he cleared the remaining sand away and lifted the object out. It was a small backpack, the kind a young child would wear to school. Its once bright blue color was faded and stained by seawater, and a cartoon rocket ship was barely visible on its front pocket. It was heavy with water and sand. Leo's heart gave a painful thud against his ribs. He unzipped the main compartment with gentle, practiced fingers. Inside, a sodden coloring book had bled its pages into a pulpy, colorful mass. But in the front pocket, he found a small, clear plastic bag, sealed at the top. It had protected its contents from the water. Leo's hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside were two items. The first was a crayon drawing of 3 stick figures, a man, a woman, and a small child, holding hands next to a smiling sun and a large boat on a blue, wavy sea. The second item was a luggage tag. It was a simple paper tag encased in a plastic sleeve. On it, in neat printed handwriting, were the words, "Lily M. Destination, Halifax, NS, Canada." Leo stared at the name, at the destination. Lily, Canada, a child's backpack buried on a hidden beach next to a secret boat slip, the hostile, hopeless faces of the townspeople, the rampant sickness. Colonel Donovan's cryptic letter about a final mission, about saving people. The pieces began to fall into place, not as a clear picture, but as the dark, unsettling outline of one. This wasn't just a place of industry and decay. It was a place of departure, a place of escape. This secret land he had inherited, he realized with a growing certainty, had been a final, desperate stepping stone on a journey away from a slow and silent death. And a little girl named Lily had been one of its passengers. Leo stood up, the small, precious tag held carefully in his hand, and looked out across the gray, churning water toward the north. Kaiser sat beside him, leaning his weight against Leo's leg, his duty done. The child's luggage tag felt impossibly small and fragile in Leo's hand, a tiny testament to a life uprooted. He stood on the hidden beach, the cold wind whipping off the water, and stared at the camouflaged boat slip. The questions that had been swirling in his mind since he read the colonel's letter now had a focal point. The answer, he knew, was in there. Leaving the backpack where Kaiser had found it, Leo approached the entrance to the hidden structure. The heavy canvas tarp was stiff with age and sea salt, and the chains holding it down were thick with rust. It took all of his strength to unhook one of the heavy anchors from its mooring. With a groan of protesting metal, he managed to create a large enough opening to slip through. He stepped inside, Kaiser following so closely that the dog's side brushed against his leg. The air within was cool, still, and thick with the smells of diesel, salt, and old wood. It was a place out of time, a sanctuary hidden from the decay that ravaged the rest of the shipyard. Floating peacefully in the calm, dark water of the slip was a boat. It was not a sleek, modern vessel. It was an old, broad-beamed fishing trawler, perhaps 40 feet long, with a sturdy wheelhouse and a wide open deck. Its white paint was clean, a stark contrast to the rust and grime outside, and its wooden trim was well oiled. Despite its age, every piece of brass on it gleamed with a soft, polished luster. On its stern, painted in simple, elegant navy blue letters, was the name, the Morning Star. The name struck Leo with a quiet force. The Morning Star, the last light to hold its own against the darkness before the dawn. It was a vessel of hope. He could see now that this boat had been cared for with a devotion that went far beyond mere maintenance. It had been loved. It had been a lifeline. He stepped from the dock onto the deck, his boots making a soft, solid sound. The boat barely rocked beneath his weight. Kaiser followed, his claws making soft clicking sounds as he explored the deck, his nose working tirelessly. Leo moved toward the wheelhouse, his hand brushing against a neatly coiled rope. Everything was in its place, ready. It felt as if the captain had just stepped away for a moment and would be back any minute to start the engine and head out to sea. He entered the small cabin. It was Spartan but immaculately clean. A compass and other nautical instruments were mounted near the ship's wheel. A well-worn chart of the Maine coastline and the Canadian Maritimes was spread out on a small table. He searched the compartments for a standard ship's log, the official record of its voyages, but found nothing. There were manuals for the engine, spare parts, and neatly folded wool blankets, but no logbook. It was a ghost ship, its history deliberately erased. He was about to give up his search of the cabin when he noticed Kaiser. The dog was not exploring anymore. He was standing perfectly still in the narrow space between the chart table and the hull, his head lowered. He let out a low, almost inaudible whine and pawed gently at the wooden floorboards. "What have you got, buddy?" Leo whispered. Kaiser looked up at him, then back down at the floor, whining again, this time with more insistence. He pawed at the same spot, his claws scraping against the wood. Leo knelt, running his hand over the floorboards. They seemed solid, flush with the rest of the floor. But as he pressed down, he felt a slight give, a tiny inconsistency that he would never have noticed without his partner's help. He pulled a multi-tool from his pocket and used the flathead screwdriver to carefully pry at the edge of the board. It resisted for a moment, then lifted with a soft sigh of displaced air. Beneath it lay not the dark bilge of the ship, but a shallow, lead-lined, waterproof compartment, and inside, resting on a bed of silica gel packets to keep it dry, was a single, thick, leather-bound book. Leo lifted it out. It was heavy, its cover smooth and worn from frequent handling. With a deep breath, he carried the book to the chart table, sat down on the captain's stool, and opened it. It was not a ship's log. It was something far more personal, far more devastating. The pages were filled with Colonel Donovan's sharp, precise handwriting. Each entry was a quiet testament to his secret war. The first entry was dated nearly 7 years ago, not long after his wife had passed away. Leo began to read, his heart growing heavier with every line. Family, the Abernathy's, John, Mary, Samuel, age 6. Health assessment, Samuel experiencing severe respiratory distress. John shows signs of chronic fatigue, persistent rash. Mary pregnant, high risk. Departure, August 19, 2018, 23:45. Thick coastal fog. Visibility, less than 100 feet. Destination, Yarmouth Safe Contact. Entry after entry told the same heartbreaking story. A family name, followed by a brief, clinical, and all too familiar assessment of their health. Family, the Riley family, Thomas, Susan, Chloe, age 9, Ben, age 5. Health assessment, Chloe suffers from debilitating migraines. Thomas has lost 30 pounds in the last year, cause unknown. All members show elevated levels of lead. Family, the Jenkins family, Mark, Sarah, Lily, age 4. Health assessment, Lily, recurring infections, asthmatic. Mark, early onset arthritis. Departure, September 2nd, 2024. 01:20. Edge of Hurricane Lee. Gale force northeasterly winds. Heavy seas. A difficult passage, but necessary for cover. Leo's eyes stopped on the last entry. Lily, the little girl from the backpack. He could almost see her, a small, frail child being bundled onto this very boat in the dead of night, the wind howling around them as the morning star slipped out of the cove, like a ghost, fighting the storm to carry its precious cargo to safety. The logbook was a meticulous record of quiet heroism. The colonel had used the worst of nature, the fog, the storms, the impenetrable darkness, as a shield to protect these families from a slow, unnatural death. Leo closed the book, his hand resting on its worn leather cover. He finally understood. The colonel had not been running from a fight. He had been running toward one in the only way he knew how. He couldn't cure the sickness, so he had decided to ferry the people to a place where they might have a chance to heal. The weight of the silent legacy he had inherited settled fully upon him. This boat, this book, this secret. It was all his now. His to protect and his to finish. 3 weeks passed in a blur of quiet labor and heavy contemplation. The initial shock of his discovery aboard the Morning Star had solidified into a grim resolve. Each morning, Leo would wake with the sun and head straight to the hidden slip, Kaiser trotting faithfully at his side. He wasn't just exploring anymore, he was preparing. He cleared the overgrown path, making it passable. He meticulously cleaned the boat's cabin, aired out the musty blankets, and spent hours in the engine room with the colonel's old manuals, slowly, carefully, bringing the diesel engine back to a state of readiness. The work was a balm for his restless soul. It gave him a purpose that felt more tangible than anything he had known since the Army. With each task, he felt a deeper connection to the colonel and the silent, desperate war he had waged. He would often pause in his work and reread passages from the logbook, the names of the families branding themselves into his memory. Lily, Samuel, Chloe. They were not just names on a page. They were the ghosts of this place, and Leo had become their unlikely custodian. His activity, however quiet, did not go unnoticed. He had felt the eyes of the townspeople on him whenever he had to drive in for supplies. Their stares were no longer just hostile, they were laced with a nervous, fearful curiosity. He was the stranger who had taken over the old Donovan place, the man who was stirring the sleeping ghosts of Port Blossom. The disruption he had been expecting arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the form of a car so black and glossy it seemed to absorb the gray light of the sky. It was a luxury sedan, utterly alien against the backdrop of rust and decay that crunched to a halt just outside the shipyard's main gate. Kaiser, who had been dozing in a patch of thin sunlight, was on his feet in an instant, a low, guttural growl vibrating in his chest. His ears were flat against his head, his body coiled like a spring. "Easy, boy," Leo said softly, placing a calming hand on the dog's back, though he felt a similar tension coiling in his own gut. A man stepped out of the driver's side. He was tall and wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Leo's truck. His dark hair was slicked back, and his face was a mask of bored arrogance. He looked at the shipyard not as property, but as an infection on the landscape. This was a man who had never had dirt under his fingernails in his life. "Leo Maxwell?" the man called out, his voice sharp and impatient. He did not approach the gate, but stood by his car as if expecting Leo to come to him. Leo walked slowly toward the fence, Kaiser moving in lockstep with him, the growl never ceasing. "I'm Leo Maxwell. Who are you?" "Julian Croft," the man said, clipping off the words. He gave a curt nod. "I'm the Director of Security for the Astrachem Corporation." The name landed like a stone in the pit of Leo's stomach. Astrachem, the name he had seen mentioned in the margins of the colonel's logbook, next to notes about environmental reports from the 1990s. Croft's eyes swept over Leo's worn jeans and faded work shirt with unconcealed disdain. "Look, I'll be brief. My company is aware that this Relic, he gestured vaguely at the shipyard, has come under new ownership. Frankly, it's an eyesore and an environmental hazard. Astrachem is prepared to make you a generous offer to take it off your hands. We have a corporate responsibility initiative. We'll purchase the land, handle the necessary environmental remediation, and you can walk away with a nice little profit. The word remediation was coated in a layer of insincerity so thick it was almost suffocating. It wasn't an offer. It was a threat. It was a message. We know what happened here, and we are here to bury it for good. I'm not interested in selling, Leo said, his voice level and calm. Croft's thin smile tightened. Perhaps you misunderstand. This isn't a negotiation. The place is a toxic liability. We're doing you a favor, $500,000. The offer is on the table until Friday. The answer is still no. A flicker of genuine anger crossed Croft's face. He looked from Leo to the silent, menacing form of Kaiser, whose growl had deepened. Have it your way, he snapped. He got back into his car, the door closing with a soft, expensive thud. The black sedan turned around and sped away, leaving only a cloud of dust and a profound sense of dread in its wake. That evening, as twilight bled across the sky, Leo sat on the steps of the small watchman's cottage he had cleaned out for shelter. The encounter had shaken him. The enemy now had a face. A quiet sound from the gate made him look up. An old, beaten-up station wagon had pulled to a stop, and a figure was walking toward the cottage. It was an elderly woman, moving with a steady, determined gait. Kaiser stood up but did not growl, his tail giving a single inquisitive wag. She stopped a respectful distance away. She was in her 70s, with a cloud of wiry gray hair pulled back from her face. She wore a practical coat and sturdy shoes, but it was her eyes that held Leo's attention. They were dark, intelligent, and filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed ancient. "Mr. Maxwell?" she asked, her voice surprisingly strong. "My name is Elena Petrova. I'm the town's doctor, or what's left of it." Leo nodded slowly, gesturing to a simple wooden crate next to him. "Please, have a seat, doctor." She sat down, her gaze sweeping over the shipyard, before landing on him. "I saw Julian Croft's car leaving here earlier. That man is a vulture in a $1,000 suit. I imagine he wasn't here for a friendly chat." "He made an offer for the shipyard," Leo said, watching her carefully. Dr. Petrova gave a short, bitter laugh. "An offer to bury the evidence, you mean? I was a good friend of James Donovan's. He and we saw what was happening to this town long before anyone else wanted to admit it." She looked at Leo, her expression searching. "The sickness you see in this town, Mr. Maxwell, it isn't bad luck. It isn't a curse. It has a name. It's the Astrachem sickness. For 30 years, their old plant at the edge of town leached chemicals into our water supply. The company knows. They paid for studies that buried the results, paid for settlements that bought silence. They poisoned us, and then they paid to pretend it never happened." Everything she said confirmed the grim story told in the pages of the logbook. "The Colonel's mission," Leo began, his voice barely a whisper, "was real," she finished for him. "He couldn't fight them in the courts, so he fought them in the dark. He gave people a way out, a chance. But I need you to know," she leaned forward, her voice dropping, "he didn't do it alone. It was too much for one man. There were a few of us, people you can trust." The words hung in the air, a lifeline in the deepening gloom. Leo looked at this tired, brave woman, and for the first time since arriving in Port Blossom, he felt something other than the crushing weight of a solitary burden. He was not alone. An alliance had just been formed, a passing of the torch in the twilight. The small watchman's cottage was filled with a fragile warmth, a stark contrast to the cold, damp night outside. A small fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting flickering shadows on the rough wooden walls. Leo and Dr. Petrova sat at a small, rickety table, mugs of hot tea cupped in their hands. Kaiser lay stretched out on the floor before the fire, his head on his paws, his eyes closed, but his ears twitching at every sound. The air was thick with the weight of shared secrets, the initial shock of revelation settling into the grim reality of their task. "For years, I've been collecting data," Dr. Petrova said, her voice low and steady. She stared into her mug as if seeing the faces of her patients in the dark liquid. "Blood tests, tissue samples, records of every birth defect, every cancer cluster. I have mountains of circumstantial evidence that points directly at Astrachem." She looked up, and the firelight caught the weary resolve in her eyes. "But it's not enough. Their lawyers are brilliant, ruthless. They argue that the town is old, that the toxins could come from anywhere, old boat paint, naturally occurring minerals, a dozen other sources. They've managed to create just enough doubt to paralyze the legal system every single time a family has tried to fight back." Leo listened, his expression grim. It was a familiar tactic. Overwhelm the truth with a flood of expensive lies until justice becomes too exhausting to pursue. "There is only one thing that can prove it beyond all doubt," the doctor continued. "A core sample, a piece of the earth taken directly from the original leak site deep inside the old factory. That specific location contains a unique chemical signature, a cocktail of contaminants that is like a fingerprint. It can be matched directly to the toxins in the bodies of my patients. It's the smoking gun." "Then we need to get it," Leo said simply. Dr. Petrova let out a long, tired sigh. "That, Mr. Maxwell, is the impossible part. The old plant has been officially decommissioned for years, but it's not abandoned. Astrachem keeps a full-time security detail there. The perimeter fence has motion sensors, and the guards patrol the grounds at random intervals. They are not protecting a worthless building. They are guarding a tomb, ensuring the secrets within stay buried." Leo fell silent, his mind shifting into a familiar mode of tactical thinking. He thought of perimeter defenses, of patrol patterns, of weaknesses. A direct assault was out of the question. "There has to be another way in," he said, more to himself than to her. "Every fortress has a flaw. Do you have any blueprints of the plant? Schematics?" "Astrachem bought and buried every official copy decades ago," she replied. "But I might have something else." She went to her car and returned with a heavy cardboard tube. "These are from the town archives, old survey maps, property layouts. I've spent countless nights staring at them, hoping to find something, anything. I never did." She unrolled the first map on the table. It was a town plan from the 1970s, showing the shipyard and the Astrachem plant as two distinct, separate properties, their borders clearly defined. They studied it for what felt like an hour, tracing roads, power lines, and property boundaries. It showed them nothing but fences and walls. They looked at another older map from the late 1960s after the properties had been sold to private owners. The result was the same. A dead end. Leo felt a prickle of frustration. He stood up and paced the small room, his gaze falling on the tube. "Are there any others in there?" "Just one," she said, her voice tinged with disappointment. "It's much older. A military survey map from right after the war, around 1946, I think. It's not very detailed." "Let's see it," Leo said. She pulled it out. It was brittle, the paper yellowed with age, and it smelled of dust and time. As she carefully unrolled it, a different picture of Port Blossom emerged. The familiar lines of the town were there, but the coastline was completely different. There were no separate lots, no private owners. The entire waterfront, from the tip of the cove to the far side of the river, was encompassed by a single, bold line. And inside that line, printed in stark military typeface, were the words, "Port Blossom Naval Supply Depot." Leo leaned over the map, his eyes wide. It was all one place, he breathed. The shipyard, the factory land, it was all part of a single naval base. Dr. Petrova looked at the map, a slow dawn of understanding on her face. "Of course," she whispered. "My father used to tell stories about it. During the Second World War, this was one of the busiest depots on the coast. They decommissioned it in the early 1960s and sold it off in parcels. Astrachem bought the main facility, and the Donovan family bought the shipworks." They both stared at the map with new eyes, no longer seeing two properties, but one unified system. Leo's finger traced the faint secondary lines drawn within the base's perimeter, lines that indicated infrastructure. "They wouldn't have built two separate utility systems," he said, his excitement growing. "They would have built one integrated network for the whole base, water, power." His finger stopped on a thick dotted line that originated in a basin on the shipyard side of the map. "And drainage." The line ran straight and true across the old map, ignoring the modern property boundaries they had just been studying. It passed directly under the fence line and terminated right in the heart of the main building of the Naval Depot, the very same building that was now the sealed, silent core of the Astrachem plant. The label next to the dotted line was faint but unmistakable: Main Storm Drain. A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Kaiser, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, lifted his head and let out a soft whine. Leo and Dr. Petrova looked at each other. The impossible task suddenly had a path. It was a dark path, a dangerous path, buried for over 60 years. But it was there. The history of the land itself had provided them with a key, a secret passage created not for espionage or escape, but for the simple, practical purpose of draining rainwater, was now their only hope for bringing justice to the light. The discovery of the storm drain map was a seismic shift, a crack of light in a seemingly impenetrable wall. But it was also terrifying. It transformed a vague sense of duty into a concrete, perilous plan. Before Leo could commit to a path that led into the dark belly of the beast, he felt a deep, gnawing need to understand the man who had set him on it. He needed to hear from the colonel one last time. He needed to know why. He left Dr. Petrova with a promise to be careful and returned to the shipyard, the old military map tucked securely in his jacket. The answer wasn't on a map or in a boat. It had to be in the one place that had served as the heart of Colonel Donovan's life here, his office. The office was in the main administration building, a 2-story brick structure that had somehow withstood the decay better than the steel warehouses around it. Leo pushed open the heavy oak door, and a cloud of dust motes swirled in the beam of his flashlight. The room was just as Donovan had left it. A large wooden desk stood facing the wide windows that overlooked the cove. Books on naval history and engineering lined the shelves. A framed photograph on the desk showed a smiling, vibrant woman with kind eyes and dark, wavy hair. Donovan's wife, Eleanor. Leo spent over an hour searching. He went through every drawer, every file cabinet, every book. He found old shipyard invoices, maintenance records, tax documents, the mundane paper trail of a legitimate business. There was nothing that hinted at a secret war, nothing that spoke of a mission. Frustrated, he sat down in the colonel's creaking leather chair and stared at the empty room. Kaiser, who had been patiently sniffing every corner, suddenly became alert. He had been circling the room, but now he stopped, his body rigid, his focus locked on the stone hearth of the fireplace. It was cold and dark, filled with the ashes of a long-dead fire. The dog walked to the hearth and whined, a low, questioning sound. He nudged the cold stones with his nose, then looked back at Leo. "There's nothing there, boy," Leo said, his voice tired. Kaiser was insistent. He whined again, louder this time, and pawed at the thick flagstones that made up the floor in front of the fireplace. His claws made a soft scratching sound on the stone. It was the same specific, focused behavior he had shown on the boat. He had found something. Leo got up, his flashlight beam following the dog. He knelt and examined the flagstones. They looked ancient, set deep in the foundation, but as he ran his fingers along the grout lines, he felt it. One stone, right in the center, had a slightly wider gap around its edges. He pressed down, and it shifted, just a millimeter, but it was enough. Using the pry bar from his multi-tool, he worked it into the crack. It took several minutes of careful, patient effort, but finally, the heavy stone tilted upwards with a grating sound. Beneath it was a dark square cavity, and nestled inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was an old iron box. His heart pounding, Leo lifted the box out. It was heavy and secured with a simple latch. He opened it. The top layer was filled with medical files, bound with string. He recognized the format instantly from his medic training. They were clinical records, filled with lab results, doctor's notes, and harrowing descriptions of a patient's steady decline. The name on every file was Eleanor Donovan. Beneath the files was a small, portable cassette recorder and a single, carefully labeled audio tape. The label, in the colonel's handwriting, simply said, "For Leo." Leo's hands shook as he took the recorder and the tape. He sat down at the desk, facing the photograph of the smiling woman, and pressed the play button. For a moment, there was only the soft hiss of the tape. Then, a voice filled the silent office. It was the colonel's voice, but not as Leo remembered it, commanding, confident, and clear. This voice was raspy, heavy with an unspeakable grief. "Leo, son, if you're hearing this, it means you've looked past the rust and ruin and found the heart of the matter. I hope you have. I need you to understand." There was a long pause, the sound of a heavy sigh. "When Eleanor first got sick," the voice continued, "the doctors were baffled. It started with headaches, then fatigue, the kind that seeps into your bones. They ran every test. They had no answers. I watched the most vibrant woman I had ever known fade away, day by day, in a sterile hospital room. She died in the spring of 2015. The official cause was a rare, aggressive form of leukemia." The pain in the colonel's voice was a raw, open wound. "I'm a soldier, Leo. When you lose a battle, you study the enemy. You learn their tactics. So I started digging. I paid for my own independent lab tests on her tissue samples. I spent a fortune. And I found them. The specific chemical markers. A toxic signature that didn't belong in any human body. I took those results to a lawyer, a good one. He traced the chemicals back to their source, to a specific industrial runoff profile. The profile of the Astrachem plant, right here in our hometown. The tape hissed. Leo could hear the sound of a glass being set down on a hard surface. I thought I had them. We filed a lawsuit. And that's when I learned what true power is. Astrachem buried us. They buried us in motions, in delays, in countersuits. They hired experts who testified that the chemicals were harmless. They produced their own falsified environmental studies. They painted me as a grieving husband, lost in conspiracy theories. They bled me dry, Leo. In the end, the court dismissed the case. They had made the truth disappear. Chow, Leo closed his eyes, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the desk. That's when I understood. The colonel's voice was barely a whisper now. The law can't protect you when the enemy owns the law. I had failed Eleanor in life. I could not fail the people of this town, her people, in death. I looked at the families here, at their children, and I saw my Eleanor's story beginning all over again. And I made a choice. Operation Morning Star. It wasn't a plan for justice. It was an evacuation, an act of atonement. It was my confession that I had lost the war, and the only honorable thing left to do was to get the civilians off the battlefield. I used my savings, my pension, everything I had left to give them a chance to escape. It wasn't justice, but it was all I had to give. The tape clicked and went silent. Leo sat in the darkness for a long time, the colonel's last words echoing in the profound silence of the office. He looked at the photograph of Eleanor Donovan, then at the medical files on the desk. He finally understood the true weight of the legacy he had inherited. It wasn't a piece of land or a collection of rusting buildings. It was a promise. It was a sacred duty, passed from a broken-hearted soldier to the one man he trusted to see it through. The morning after listening to the colonel's confession, the world felt different. The gray sky over Port Blossom seemed less a sign of gloom and more a call to action. The weight of the mission was still immense, but it was no longer a burden of confusion. It was a mantle of responsibility, and for the first time in years, Leo felt its familiar, clarifying weight on his shoulders. He met Dr. Petrova at the cottage as the tide was coming in. He didn't need to say much. She saw the change in him immediately. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a flinty, unwavering resolve. He told her everything he had heard on the tape, his voice low and steady as he recounted the story of Eleanor Donovan's tragic death and the colonel's subsequent secret war. When he finished, Dr. Petrova simply nodded, her eyes glistening. "I knew parts of it," she said softly. "I knew his heart was broken. I just never knew how much. He carried it all alone for so long." She looked from Leo to the iron box on the table, then to the leather-bound logbook beside it. But he's not alone anymore. Their path was clear. Before they could risk the infiltration for the final physical proof, they needed an army of voices. "We need to know if they'll stand with us," Leo said, his hand resting on the logbook. "The people he saved, if they'll speak." Dr. Petrova's expression was a mixture of hope and fear. "It's a lot to ask. Astrachem made them all sign non-disclosure agreements when they accepted the settlements for their homes. Those agreements have severe financial penalties. They are safe now, living new lives. Asking them to come back into the fire." Her voice trailed off. "The colonel gave them a chance to live," Leo said. "All we're asking is if they're willing to fight for the people left behind." They opened the book on the table, its pages filled with the ghosts of Port Blossom. "Doctor," Petrova's finger traced over the names, her breath catching as she recognized former patients, old neighbors, the children she had delivered. For their first call, the choice was obvious. Family, the Jenkins family. Mark, Sarah, Lily, age 4. Leo felt a knot in his stomach as he looked at the name. Lily. The little girl with the rocket ship backpack. Dr. Petrova found the contact information Donovan had meticulously recorded. A phone number in a small town just outside Halifax. With a steadying breath, she dialed the number on her satellite phone, a piece of equipment she kept for emergencies. It rang 3 times before a woman's voice, cautious and hesitant, answered. "Hello?" "Sarah?" Dr. Petrova said, her own voice gentle. "Sarah Jenkins? It's Dr. Elena Petrova from Port Blossom." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a long, stunned silence. Leo could hear the faint sound of a child laughing in the background. A healthy child. "Doctor? Petrova?" Sarah's voice was a choked whisper. "How? Is everything all right?" "Everything is the same as it was, Sarah, which means it is not all right," the doctor replied calmly. "I'm calling about Colonel Donovan. He passed away a few weeks ago." A soft cry came through the phone. "Oh no, that wonderful, wonderful man. He saved us. He saved our Lily." "I know he did, my dear," Dr. Petrova said, her voice full of compassion. "And his work isn't finished. He left his legacy to a successor, a good man who wants to finish the fight. But he can't do it alone. We need your help. We need your voice." The fear was immediate in Sarah's reply. "The papers we signed, the agreement, they said they could take everything if we ever spoke about it. We can't. Mark has a good job now. Lily is in school. She's healthy for the first time in her life. We can't risk losing it all. I know what they made you sign, Dr. Petrova said firmly. It was an agreement made under duress to protect a crime. It will not stand up in the light of day. We are building a case, Sarah. We have a plan to get the final proof we need to expose them for good. But the proof is nothing without the stories, without the people. We need you to be the voice for Lily and for all the children still breathing that poison. Another silence stretched. Longer this time. Leo held his breath. He could hear the muffled sounds of Sarah speaking to her husband in the background. Then she came back on the line, her voice no longer hesitant, but clear and strong, forged in a fire of maternal love. Tell us what you need us to do. A single tear traced a path through the dust on Dr. Petrova's cheek. The first thread in the network had been pulled, and it held strong. The rest of the day was a marathon of quiet, intense phone calls. They moved through the logbook, entry by entry. An old fisherman in Newfoundland who had lost 2 brothers to lung ailments. A young couple who had moved to Vermont and had their first healthy baby. A retired teacher in Prince Edward Island. The stories were all different, but the responses were the same. There was fear, always at first. The trauma of what they had endured was a deep and lasting scar. But beneath the fear was a bedrock of gratitude for the colonel and a simmering anger at the injustice that had forced them from their homes. One by one, they agreed. They would testify. They would sign affidavits. They would break the silence. The quiet, desperate evacuations of the past were coalescing into a powerful chorus for the future. By late evening, they had a list of over 24 families, a network of hope stretching across North America, all bound by a shared history and a renewed will to fight. We have the heart of the story, Leo said, looking at the list of names. Now we need the megaphone. I know someone, Dr. Petrova said, a new energy in her voice. A journalist, one of the last of the old guard. His name is David Chen. He's made a career out of taking on corporations like Astrachem. He's fearless, and more importantly, he's thorough. He won't run a story until it's ironclad. Leo nodded. It was the right move. He was the one who made the call. He found the main number for Chen's newspaper and left a carefully worded message. An hour later, his phone rang. The number was blocked. This is David Chen. Who am I speaking with? The voice was skeptical, professional, and sharp. My name is Leo Maxwell, Leo began. I am calling you from Port Blossom, Maine. I have a story for you concerning the Astrachem Corporation and decades of criminal negligence, backed by medical records and the testimony of more than 24 families who were forced to flee the town. There was a pause on the other end. That's a heavy accusation. Testimony is good, but it can be dismissed. What else do you have? We have a plan to acquire the final irrefutable physical proof, Leo said. A core sample from the source of the contamination. When we have it, we will call you again. And when we do, you will have the biggest story of your career. Another pause, longer this time. Leo could almost hear the journalist's mind working, weighing the risk against the potential reward. Get your proof, Mr. Maxwell, Chen said finally, a new note of intrigue in his voice. You have my attention. I'll be waiting for your call. The line went dead. Leo lowered the phone. All the pieces were now in place. The witnesses were ready. The media was primed. The mission was set. All that was left was to walk through the darkness into the heart of the enemy's fortress. With the network of witnesses waiting in the wings and a journalist on standby, the mission entered its most critical phase. The watchman's cottage transformed from a simple shelter into a command center. The old military map, yellowed and fragile, was spread permanently across the table, held down at its corners by mugs and books. It became their scripture, a guide to the dark path that lay ahead. The days that followed were a blur of intense, whispered collaboration. Leo and Dr. Petrova worked with a synergy born of shared purpose, their different life experiences complementing each other perfectly. Their plan was not one of force, but of precision, stealth, and meticulous calculation. Leo, drawing on his years of military training, took charge of the tactical elements. "The mission has 3 phases," he explained one evening, tracing a line on the map with his finger. "Infiltration, acquisition, and exfiltration. We move only under the cover of the storm predicted for this weekend. The wind and rain will help mask any sound we make." He pointed to the entrance of the storm drain on the shipyard grounds. "This is our insertion point. From there, it's a straight line, roughly a quarter-mile underground, to the factory's foundation." Dr. Petrova leaned over the map, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her role was the science of the mission. She had spent 2 days in her small clinic, assembling a specialized kit. "The sample has to be pristine, Leo. It can't be contaminated. I've prepared a hand-operated soil auger. We need to drill down at least 3 feet, past the surface soil, to get to the core saturation. The samples will go into these," she said, pointing to a case of sterile, vacuum-sealed glass vials. "We get one chance at this. It has to be perfect." Her knowledge of the factory's history was their greatest asset in planning for the worst-case scenario. "This section here," she said, circling a part of the building on an old blueprint she had managed to save, was the old chemical mixing depot. According to the manifests from the 1980s, they stored large quantities of sulfur and chlorine compounds there. "If we get into trouble, a distraction is our only weapon. Certain combinations of those chemicals, when mixed with water, can produce a thick, disorienting, and completely non-lethal smokescreen. It would be our only way out." Their preparations were quiet and deliberate. Leo gathered gear from the shipyard's old supply sheds: a coil of sturdy rope, a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters, and 2 headlamps, whose bulbs he carefully covered with a thin layer of red gel to preserve their night vision. Dr. Petrova added her scientific tools to the growing pile: the sampling kit, a portable air quality monitor to warn them of toxic gases in the tunnel, and thick neoprene gloves. It was the equipment of a rescue mission, not an attack. But the most crucial member of their team required a different kind of preparation. In a mission that demanded absolute silence, verbal commands were a liability. Kaiser had to become an extension of Leo's thoughts, responding to silence as readily as he did to speech. Leo spent hours each day in the secluded space near the hidden boat slip, training his partner. The work was a study in patience and the profound unspoken bond between them. He started simply. He would hold his palm flat, facing the dog, and say the word "stay," rewarding Kaiser with a quiet rub when he obeyed. After a dozen repetitions, he would drop the word, using only the hand signal. Kaiser, his intelligent eyes locked on Leo's, understood almost instantly. They developed their own silent language. A slow, downward wave of the hand meant, "lie down." A silent command to become invisible. A single pointed finger meant, "look," directing Kaiser's attention to a specific point. A gentle tap to his own ear meant, "listen," a request for the dog to use his superior hearing to scan their surroundings. Kaiser seemed to understand the gravity of these new lessons. There was no playful barking, no happy panting. He was focused, his body poised, his responses immediate and exact. He watched Leo's hands with an intensity that was almost human, as if he knew that a missed signal could have dire consequences. He was not just a dog being trained, he was a soldier being briefed. During one session, as Leo practiced the signal for quiet, a deer wandered into the clearing. Kaiser tensed, his muscles coiling, but he didn't make a sound. He simply looked at Leo, awaiting his next silent instruction. In that moment, Leo knew he was ready. The night of the storm arrived with a low, ominous rumble of distant thunder. A heavy, wet wind began to whip through the shipyard, rattling the corrugated steel walls of the warehouses. It was perfect. They gathered in the cottage for a final review. The gear was laid out on the floor, checked and double-checked. Leo went over the plan one last time, his voice low and calm, a stark contrast to the rising fury of the storm outside. "We go in, we get the sample, we get out," he said, looking at Dr. Petrova. "No deviations. If we encounter any resistance, we abort. We create a diversion and we get out. Understood?" Dr. Petrova nodded, her face pale but her expression resolute. "Understood." They dressed in dark, durable work clothes. Leo clipped a small waterproof pack with the sampling vials to his belt and handed the heavier toolkit to Dr. Petrova. He strapped the headlamp to his forehead. Finally, he turned to Kaiser, who was sitting patiently by the door, watching their every move. Leo knelt in front of him, looking directly into the dog's steady, trusting eyes. He didn't say a word. He simply rested his hand on Kaiser's head for a long moment, a silent promise to bring his friend home safe. They stepped out into the raging wind and driving rain. The storm was their shield, the darkness their cloak. They made their way to the far side of the shipyard, to a large concrete basin where a rusted iron grate covered the entrance to the main storm drain. Leo used the bolt cutters, the snap of the old lock swallowed by a clap of thunder. He and the doctor worked together to pull the heavy grate aside, revealing a dark, gaping hole that smelled of damp earth and decay. This was the point of no return. Leo switched on his headlamp, its red beam cutting a soft, eerie glow in the darkness. He looked at Kaiser and gave the first official command of the mission, a single, pointed finger directed at the blackness of the tunnel. "Look." Then he patted his own leg, a gentle forward motion. "Proceed." Without a sound, Kaiser stepped past him and descended into the dark, a silent gray shadow leading the way into the heart of the fight. The tunnel was a cold, dark throat, swallowing them whole. The only sounds were the gurgle of storm water rushing through the main channel and the soft scrape of their own movements. The air was heavy and smelled of wet concrete, rot, and the faintest chemical tang, a metallic bite that grew stronger the deeper they went. Leo led the way, his red headlamp cutting a short, bloody swath through the oppressive blackness. Dr. Petrova followed close behind, her breathing steady, her focus absolute. But their true guide was Kaiser. The dog moved ahead of them, a silent phantom in the dark. He was their eyes and ears, his senses probing the darkness far beyond the reach of their feeble lights. Every few yards he would pause, his head cocked, listening. He would look back at Leo, and Leo, reading his calm posture, would give a silent hand signal to proceed. It was a slow, nerve-wracking advance through the forgotten arteries of the old naval base. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel ended at a rusted iron ladder leading straight up into darkness. Leo gave Kaiser the signal to stay, the dog melting into the shadows at the base of the ladder, becoming a silent, watchful guardian. Leo climbed first, pushing open a heavy iron grate that groaned in protest. He emerged into a vast, cavernous space. It was the sub-basement of the Astrachem plant. He helped Dr. Petrova up and then gave a soft whistle for Kaiser, who scaled the ladder with an agile grace that defied his size. They were in. The air here was colder, and the chemical smell was much stronger. Dr. Petrova pulled out her air quality monitor, its small screen casting a green glow on her face. The readings were high, but not yet in the danger zone. Navigating by memory from the blueprints, they moved through a maze of silent, hulking machinery. Pipes as thick as trees snaked across the ceiling, dripping a foul-smelling liquid into stagnant puddles on the floor. It was a dead place, but it felt alive with a malevolent energy, the ghost of the poison it had created. They found the spot directly below the main mixing vats, exactly where the maps had indicated. The concrete floor here was fractured and discolored, and a dark, oily sludge seeped up from the cracks. This was ground zero. "Here," Dr. Petrova whispered, her voice tight. "This is it." While Leo stood guard, his senses on high alert, The doctor worked with swift, practiced efficiency. She opened her kit, attached the auger, and began to drill into the contaminated earth. The sound was horribly loud in the crushing silence. Every turn of the handle seemed to echo through the vast, empty building. After a few tense minutes, she had the core sample. She carefully transferred the dark, toxic soil into a sterile glass vial and sealed it. She held it up in the red glow of their lights. It looked like a vial of black blood, the heart of the crime. "We have it," she said, a tremor of triumph in her voice. "Let's go." It was then that the world exploded in a blaze of white light. Multiple high-powered flashlights flooded the basement, pinning them in their beams like terrified animals. "Well, well," a familiar, arrogant voice echoed from the darkness. "The rats have come for a midnight snack." Julian Croft stepped into the light, a cruel, satisfied smirk on his face. He was flanked by two large, grim-faced security guards. "Did you really think we wouldn't have this place monitored?" Croft sneered. "Silent alarms, very sophisticated. I must thank you, Maxwell. You've saved me the trouble of hunting you down. Now, be a good boy and hand over whatever it is you think you found." The guards began to advance, their heavy boots crunching on the gravelly floor. There was nowhere to run. They were trapped, their backs to a wall of pipes and decaying machinery. But Leo wasn't looking at the guards. His eyes were scanning the room, his mind racing, connecting the dots from their planning session. To his right, he saw what he was looking for: a row of large, rotting paper sacks stacked on a pallet, their contents labeled with chemical formulas. Next to them, a series of leaky pipes dripped water onto the floor, forming a large puddle. It was exactly as Dr. Petrova had predicted. "Doctor," Leo said, his voice low and urgent, never taking his eyes off the approaching guards. "Cover your face, now." She didn't question him. She pulled the collar of her coat over her nose and mouth. Leo gave Kaiser a sharp, silent signal, the flat of his hand, and the dog immediately dropped to the ground, tucking his head low. As the first guard reached for him, Leo moved. He lunged not at the man, but at the pallet of chemicals. With a surge of adrenaline, he ripped open two different sacks, one containing a sulfur compound, the other a powdery lime agent, and kicked the contents into the large puddle on the floor. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. A thick, choking cloud of yellow-gray smoke erupted with a furious hiss, boiling upwards and outwards. It wasn't lethal, but it was brutally effective. The air filled with the smell of rotten eggs and acrid chemicals. The guards stopped in their tracks, coughing and gagging, their eyes streaming with tears. The white beams of their flashlights scattered as they stumbled back, disoriented. "Get them!" Croft roared, his voice muffled as he covered his own face. But Leo was already moving. In the swirling, chaotic smoke, he scrambled toward a large, rust-red wheel on a nearby containment tank, the emergency discharge valve they had marked on the blueprint. It was their one and only escape plan. He grabbed the cold iron with both hands and turned with all his might. For a heart-stopping moment, it didn't budge. Then, with a deep, protesting groan of ancient metal, it began to turn. A low rumble started deep within the tank, and a torrent of thick, black, viscous sludge began to pour from a discharge pipe near the floor, spreading rapidly. "This way!" Leo yelled to Dr. Petrova. The sludge was a moving wall, blocking the guard's path, an impassable mire of industrial waste. Visibility was now almost zero. The smoke was a thick, blinding fog, but they had a guide who didn't need to see. Leo made a soft, clicking sound with his tongue, a signal they had practiced. Through the smoke, a gray and white shadow appeared. Kaiser. The dog moved low to the ground, beneath the worst of the smoke, his nose guiding him with unerring accuracy. They followed him, crawling and stumbling through the maze of machinery, their lungs burning, their eyes streaming. They could hear Croft shouting furiously behind them, but his voice was growing more distant, swallowed by the chaos they had unleashed. Kaiser led them not back to the main tunnel, but to a smaller secondary service duct they had identified as an alternate escape route. The opening was small, but just big enough. Dr. Petrova scrambled through first, then Leo pushed Kaiser through after her. He took one last look back into the smoky, dark chaos, then pulled himself into the narrow duct, dragging a heavy grate closed behind them. They were safe. In his pack, secured in its sterile vial, was the final piece of evidence: the heart of the crime, stolen from the dragon's lair. The escape from the Astrachem plant was a blur of adrenaline and burning lungs. They crawled through the narrow service duct, the stench of chemicals and the metallic tang of fear clinging to them. Kaiser, ever vigilant, wriggled ahead, his low growls guiding them through the suffocating darkness until they finally emerged into the cool, rain-swept night air, gasping for breath. The storm still raged, a fitting backdrop to the chaotic symphony they had just unleashed. They made it back to the shipyard, exhausted but triumphant. The sterile vial, clutched tightly in Dr. Petrova's hand, was their trophy. The very next morning, despite their fatigue, Leo made the call. "Mr. Chen," he said, his voice hoarse but firm, "we have it. The proof you asked for." David Chen, the journalist, wasted no time. He flew to Port Blossom that same day, his demeanor professional and intense. He spent hours with Leo and Dr. C. Petrova, poring over the colonel's logbook, reviewing the medical files, and examining the vial of toxic earth. He then conducted a series of in-depth interviews, speaking with Dr. Petrova at length about her decades of medical observations, and listening patiently as Leo recounted the colonel's confession and the harrowing details of their infiltration. Chen's team of independent scientists verified the core sample, matching its unique chemical signature to the toxins found in the blood samples Dr. Petrova had provided. The evidence was irrefutable. A week later, the storm hit, not of wind and rain, but of information. The headline blazed across the front page of national newspapers, online news portals, and television screens. Port Blossom's poison: how Astrachem buried a town and its secrets for decades. The story was a bombshell. David Chen had woven together the meticulous details of Dr. Petrova's medical records, the poignant tales of families forced to flee aboard the Morning Star, and the devastating truth from Colonel Donovan's confession tape. He painted a damning picture of corporate greed, environmental negligence, and a shocking cover-up that had spanned generations. The core sample was the undeniable physical proof. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for Astrachem. Shares plummeted. Public outrage boiled over. Lawsuits, which had been dismissed for years, were immediately reopened. State and federal environmental agencies launched full-scale investigations, backed by the undeniable evidence and the powerful testimonies of the Network of Hope. Julian Croft and other key executives were arrested, charged with obstruction of justice and environmental crimes. The empire of lies built on the suffering of Port Blossom crumbled in a matter of weeks. The quiet, almost invisible citizens of Port Blossom, who had lived under a cloud of sickness and despair for so long, suddenly found themselves in the national spotlight. There was anger, yes, a righteous fury that had been suppressed for too long. But beneath it, a fragile seedling of hope began to bloom. Months later, the physical and emotional scars of Port Blossom remained, but the festering wound of injustice had begun to heal. The Astrachem plant, once a symbol of oppression, was seized by the government. A massive federal cleanup operation was initiated, promising to restore the poisoned land and water. A multi-million-dollar compensation fund was established for the victims and their families. For Leo, the fight was over, but his purpose was not. The Port Blossom shipyard, once a place of rust and decay, then a clandestine refuge, found its final profound transformation. It became the Donovan Hope Foundation, It was a non-profit organization dedicated to assisting victims of industrial pollution across the country, providing legal aid, medical resources, and resettlement assistance. The old office where Leo had found the colonel's confession was meticulously restored and became the Foundation's headquarters. The hidden boat slip, once a secret gateway to freedom, was now openly used to launch small research vessels that monitored the ongoing cleanup efforts in the cove. The Morning Star itself was carefully preserved in a new, glass-sided dry dock, a beautiful, solemn monument to the hope it once carried. Leo, with Dr. Petrova by his side, became the Foundation's first director. He channeled his military discipline and his medic's compassion into building a robust organization. He worked tirelessly, driven by the memory of Eleanor Donovan and the quiet heroism of the colonel. He often found himself walking the revitalized grounds of the shipyard, no longer a place of ghosts, but of new beginnings. Kaiser, now a beloved fixture of the Foundation, would always be by his side. The dog, no longer needing to hunt for hidden secrets, seemed to walk with a lighter step, his senses now attuned to the simple joys of seagulls crying overhead and the scent of clean salt air. One crisp autumn morning, as the sun finally broke through the perpetual gray of Port Blossom, casting golden light across the cove, Leo stood on the newly rebuilt dock. Dr. Petrova, now a trusted friend and colleague, joined him, a rare, genuine smile gracing her lips. "Look, Leo," she said, pointing out to sea. A small fishing boat, painted a bright, hopeful blue, was heading out of the harbor. Its crew, clearly from Port Blossom, waved at them. Their faces were no longer drawn and weary. They held the promise of health, of a future. Leo smiled, a deep, contented smile that reached his eyes. He bent down and scratched Kaiser behind the ears. The dog leaned into his touch, his silver-gray head resting against Leo's leg. The journey had been long, fraught with danger and sorrow, but they had completed the mission. They had honored the colonel's legacy. And in doing so, Leo had found more than just peace. He had found a home, a purpose, and a quiet, enduring hope for Port Blossom. The silent legacy of despair had been transformed into a vibrant dawn. The story of Leo and Kaiser reminds us that the greatest legacies are not carved in stone, but are carried in the quiet loyalty of a loving heart. It shows that one person's courage can become another's mission, a single ripple of hope that can grow into a wave of change. If their journey resonated with you, we would be honored to have you join our storytelling family by subscribing. We invite you to share what part of their story touched you most in the comments below. By sharing this tale, you help its message of unwavering loyalty find a new heart to inspire. And the next chapter in our journey of courage is ready to begin. Just tap the video that has now appeared on your screen to continue the adventure with us.